Back in the 1860s, before the Brooklyn Bridge was built, New York City looked a lot different than it does today. All buildings were built of stone and only stood 6 stories high, mostly because the buildings would collapse if they were built any higher. The only way people could cross the East River between New York and Brooklyn was by ferry boats, and they were very inefficient. Long lines would form at the docks, and once people got on, the crossings were slow. The trip was even worse if it was very cold and windy. This is how the people of New York and Brooklyn would go to work every day or run errands. One cold day, John A. Roebling was on his way across the river. He told his son Washington A. Roebling that the ferries they were riding were no good. John Roebling, being an engineer that specializes in building bridges, thought there should be a bridge to carry people across the river. So John told people about his idea. Most people agreed with John, but not enough for the bridge to be built. All of this changed the winter of 1867. It was so cold outside that the river froze solid. The ferries were stuck in the ice and could not be used. Many people could not reach their jobs. New York and Brooklyn were unconnected from each other, and now people were willing to hear Roebling's plan. And Roebling had a very specific plan in mind. The East River carried hundreds of boats a day, and those boats had tall sails. That means the bridge was going to have to be high enough so the sails would not hit the bridge. Because of all the boats, there could not be very many towers either. Yet the East River is almost half a mile wide. The only bridge that could be used for a river like this was called a suspension bridge. Suspension bridges usually have only 2 main towers. Hanging across the towers are the main cables. The main cables are pulled to the ground with anchors at the ends. Hanging from the main cables are the suspended cables, and the roadway hangs from the suspended cables. All of these forces acting with each other can hold hundreds of tons of weight. When John designed the bridge, he drew the pictures with great detail. He showed where everything would go and how it would be built. John was done designing the bridge in 1869, but before the work started, there was an accident. John walked out onto the end of a dock to get a close look at the building site. He did not see an approaching ferry or hear the people screaming at him to move. His leg was crushed when the ferry hit the dock. John insisted to cure himself with only water, but died anyway a month later. With John A. Roebling dead, it was up to his son Washington to build the bridge. The first step to building the bridge was resting the foundation on the bedrock 44 feet below the river. This was going to be hard because in 1869, there were no machines to dig the foundation down. Everything had to be done manually. So to pull this off, John was planning on using caissons to dig down below the river. Caissons would give the workers a way to dig down without drowning in the river. As the workers hacked away at the rocks and boulders, the caissons could slowly descend until they reached the place they needed to be at. It was a very slow and painful process. The caissons lowered about 1 foot every week. And the workers had to be careful. The walls of the caissons had to be lowered in union, so the caissons would not tilt and remain level. There were 3 gangs of men, 100 in each gang, and working 8 hours each are employed in the caissons. There was no resting time. The work went on night and day. Not everything went perfect in the caissons. At one point, Washington got a message that a fire had started in the caisson. Washington was up all night trying to put the fire out. If it continued to burn, the roof would weaken and the towers would come through. Because of the high-pressure air, the fire burned hot and fast. Finally, Washington opened it full of river water. Because of this incident, Washington suffered a severe attack of Caisson disease. Caisson disease is the result of exposure to high-pressure environment. Washington could no longer direct the work at the site. Instead, he rested in his bed watching the work with binoculars, and his wife Emily Warren would be a messenger for information. The work with the caissons was falling behind, so Washington had to resort to blasting, which was extremely risky. Inside the confined space, conditions were a nightmare. However, no accidents happened with the blasting inside the caisson. And once the caissons were dug down far enough, the towers would be built. The building of the towers was not too hard. All that had to be done was laying bricks upon more bricks. But it still took time and effort. A few times the wind would blow supplies around. Slowly, the towers rose until they were over 25 stories above New York and Brooklyn, much higher than the surrounding 6-story buildings. With the towers now built, the cables would be hung. The main cables were anchored on both sides of the river. The anchorage weighed 120 million pounds, equivalent to 12,000 large elephants. The main cables were made of bundles of wire wrapped up to make 4 main cables. The wires were made of steel, which was groundbreaking. Steel had never been used before in America for tall buildings and bridges. Each cable used over 3,500 miles of steel wire that could stretch from Brooklyn to Los Angeles. To hang the suspended cables off the main cable, a skinny bridge was made for workers to walk back and forth between the main towers. And once those cables were hung and ready for the roadway, Washington decided to add diagonal cables to make the bridge even stronger and more elegant. For that to be done, sailors were hired to do the work. If the wind blew, the sailors could hold on tight and not be afraid when they looked down. Finally, the road could be built. To build the road and finish off the bridge, steel floor beams were laid out hanging by the suspenders. Then a strong wooden floor could be built. And finally, the train tracks, roadway, and walking path could be laid down on the wooden floor. The roadway seemed to float in the air up above New York and Brooklyn. It was only a matter of time. Slowly, the site of the Brooklyn Bridge came into view. Because of the diagonal cables, the bridge ended up being 6 times stronger than it needed to be. 21 men died in all during the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. But now it was built, and the finished product was amazing. After 14 years in the making, stores and businesses closed down as over 50,000 people crowded the streets to see the Brooklyn Bridge open. It was May 24th, 1883, that Chester A. Arthur, President of the United States, walked across the bridge, as well as Emily Warren, who represented Washington Roebling. Watching from his bedroom, he said, "Why can't they just put up a sign saying, 'The bridge is now open'?" However, the Irish, many of whom helped build the bridge, did not attend the celebration because it was on Queen Victoria's birthday. Victoria's birthday was very important to the Irish, and they did not want to share her honor with the bridge's opening. That night, 500 rockets were shot into the sky all at once off the bridge, and many more for long after. Today, it is still a thrill to cross the Brooklyn Bridge. Because of the use of steel, the bridge has started the vertical building era. It is the reason why New York and Brooklyn stand tall